My name is Bryan Mack. I am or was a conductor. I'm from Florence, South Carolina. I had, or well, rather 17 years in with CSX Transportation. Of course, I was a freight conductor. And I basically grew up here in town, of course, did other things, but railroad by necessarily training, of course, done other pursuits. But yes, I've had 17 years in transportation business, and of course, just interests include getting out, traveling, music, as well as cooking, fitness, and other things. But yes, I stand to make things better for the next generation, in addition to just being a good, decent person, leaving behind good things for others.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Working People, a podcast about the lives, jobs, dreams, and struggles of the working class today. Brought to you in partnership with In These Times magazine and the Real News Network, produced by Jules Taylor, and made possible by the support of listeners like you. Working People is a proud member of the Labor Radio Podcast Network. So if you're hungry for more worker and labor-focused shows like ours, follow the link in the show notes and go check out the other great shows in our network. And please support the work that we're doing here at Working People so we can keep growing and keep bringing y'all more important conversations every single week. You can support us by leaving a positive review on Apple Podcasts. You can share these episodes on your social media and share them with your friends, your coworkers, and your family members. And of course, the single best thing you can do to support our work is become a paid monthly subscriber on Patreon for just $5 a month. If you subscribe for $10 a month, you'll also get a print subscription to the amazing In These Times magazine delivered to your mailbox every month. So just head on over to patreon.com/workingpeople. That's patreon.com/workingpeople. Hit the subscribe button and you'll immediately get access to all the great bonus episodes that we've published over the past 5 seasons of the show. And we've published some really great bonus episodes recently for y'all to take advantage of if you are a Patreon subscriber. My name is Maximilian Alvarez, and I am so grateful to have Bryan on the show today. As you guys know, we have been relentlessly covering the crisis on the nation's freight railroads for well over a year now here on the podcast over at the Real News Network. And I've done some coverage on my segment at Breaking Points as well. And, I'm sad to say that, a lot of the things that we've been talking about with railroaders like Bryan over the past year and a half haven't gone away, right? I mean, we saw that in the catastrophe in East Palestine, and we continue to see it in the kind of derailments that are happening all over the country, from Minnesota to California, but also just the day-to-day grind that workers, are going through, the ways that Wall Street greed and, cost cutting, profit maximizing decisions made by corporate executives have translated to constant overwork, understaffing, trains that are probably twice as long as they should be, twice as heavy as they should be. We're in a real mess here. And if you guys have been listening to the show, pretty damn well how we got into that mess, because workers like Bryan, with so many accrued years of experience on the railroads, have been telling us left and right about this. But it's important that we don't just kind of say, okay, we know that now, let's move on, right? We need to stay committed to this. We need to stay committed to railroad workers until we start seeing some real improvements in this industry, not just for the sake of workers like Bryan themselves, and that should be enough, but also for all of our sakes. Again, I mentioned East Palestine. These are the stakes of the destruction, the corporate and Wall Street led destruction of the railroads, it's all of our problem. These trains are passing through our neighborhoods, as the great Matt Weaver of Railroad Workers United told us on the show a couple weeks ago. These trains, they're not passing through the backyards of the rich, and they're passing through our backyards, right? They're passing next to our baseball fields and our schools and through our towns, right? And so we all have a stake in this. And so I'm really, really excited to get a chance to talk to Bryan more about his life and his work, and what these kind of changes to the industry have looked like from his vantage point. But before we get there, Bryan, as I was telling you, like, as we love to do on the show, we like to kind of take our time and, walk our way through, people's backstories and learn more about them and how they came to be the people they are and how they came to do the work that they do. So you mentioned that you are a local boy. So you grew up in South Carolina.
Yes, I did. I grew up here.
Okay. So do you got deep family roots over there?
Yes, I do have family from the area. And incidentally, the town where I'm from was actually based upon the old Wilmington and Manchester Railroad, which became a part of the Atlantic Coastline Railroad, which incidentally became the Seaboard Railroad, which is now the big conglomerate, as we know, is CSX. And yes, my dad was an employee too of the company, as well as several other persons around the city, and well as friends that work for the railroad.
Wow. Okay. Tell me a little more about that. So what was it like then growing up with your dad working for the railroad, and I guess like that just being like a kind of constant presence in the town that you grew up in?
Well, it's interesting where we grew up, which was the north side of town. And my dad, just as a kid, my dad was a service attendant, and he was so close by the job and where our house, which they presently still live, if he had to be work at 7 and if he left house at 6:55 a.m., he still would have enough time to spare before he actually had to punch the time clock. That's how close we live by the yard. And you could hear whether passenger movements or freight or just even the switching of the conductors in the yard. You've heard it because the rail yard is so close, and the main line, which is the north-south route between the Northeast Washington, New York to Miami, Florida, going into Florida, which ran right through town. You heard those trains every day, all day, 24 hours a day. Good weather, bad weather, et cetera. So yes, it was a part of the town's makeup.
And was it so I have two questions here. One, how big was your family? Did you guys have a big family, or were you an only kid?
It's about small. I mean, it's just my parents, my dad, mom, myself, and I have a younger brother.
Okay. So like, I asked that because, I was also going to ask, like, did you feel like a draw to the railroads? Like, was this something that you knew from an early age that you wanted to do as well? Or were you kind of like a rebellious teenager being like, nah, I don't want to do what my dad's doing. And then like you kind of find your way into it anyhow.
Well, I'm glad you asked that. Well, knowing in a back way, my dad, when my dad's backstory a little bit, which ties into my involvement, was my dad was a service attendant when they weren't derailments, but when they had a derailment, which Florence was one of the main service points that used the derrick crane, they had what was called the wrecker. And you would take the mechanical personnel when a derailment happened, and you would go and clean it up. And my dad was the person that actually cooked for the crews and townspeople there. That he started at 5 a.m. He would go with the crew, and he had his own commissary with food, his own diner car, and he was a cook, and he fed the crews, townspeople, et cetera, so they could clean up the main line wherever the derailment was at. So he was gone a lot of the time, and when we would travel for vacation, my family and I, he would point out a lot of where he would go. He would point out towns or different locales. And of course, I would see him when my grandmother, his mother, she would come home by Amtrak. and he would actually have to water the train. So, of course, he would pick me up and then we'd go over to the station and, I'd see him work. And of course, he'd be in his work where, again, my grandmother, when she'd come in, train pulled in, you get off, speak to her. And then my mom, who would come through, pick me up, take me home. Of course, I got a chance to see that. So I knew what was going on. But my story, I was a musician. And let's just say, well, the luck of the draw of not finding a job, you kind of find your way back because it was stable income. And you knew the compensation was decent.
What kind of music did you play?
I'm actually a tubist.
Oh, hell yeah. How'd you get into that?
Well, just going through high school, I can tell you this. I retained perfect pitch. And I started sixth grade, which it wasn't really formalized in. And long story short, I was an alto saxophonist, or saxophonist for those who are exact. And I wasn't really good at it per se. But with me retaining perfect pitch, and my band director in seventh grade decided, hey, try tuba for eighth grade. And sure enough, I locked in and played tuba, and it just sort of lined up. And I studied music. Actually, I went on and studied music and did it as a sort of way to look for an end, so to speak. But then sometimes when you're doing music and trying to break certain ceilings, there weren't many people in it that looked like me. So, of course, you got to look the other ways. And it was, of course, a fun ride because the journey made me a better person. However, you still have to eat. And, of course, that's why I say stability of employment. I said, well, if it didn't work, all else, try the railroad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, man. It's I'm always so fascinated by stories like this. And I guess people who listen to the show will remember this because, it's something that I was so envious about growing up, because you say you weren't very good. Trust me, brother, you can't be any worse than I am playing an instrument. And I wanted to know how to I wanted to understand music on that level so badly. And I remember I was the only one of my siblings who showed any interest in that. My sister did guitar. She's 10 years younger than I am. That was a lot later. But when it was just me and my two brothers, my mom was constantly trying to pass off her old high school flute to one of us. And it didn't take with my brother Jesse, didn't take with Zach. And so I showed some interest. And she had this big ceremony of taking her old flute down in the closet, giving it to me. And I just couldn't play it for shit. And I couldn't read music. And my poor junior high teacher, bless her, was just okay, this kid sucks, but he clearly means well. So I was always so fascinated by people who could play music and also, make music. And I'm always so interested when I talk to folks like you about how music ends up becoming this kind of vector through which people find their paths in life. Just one example, I remember talking to these two great longshore workers out in Tacoma, Washington, Zach and Skiff, and their dads both worked on the docks as longshore workers. So their families knew each other. But both Bryan or Zach and Skiff, they got into punk music. And it was through touring with a punk band that they ended up coming into contact with each other. They became friends, and then they ended up going back to work on the docks together. And now they're best friends. They lead the young workers caucus in the ILWU. But it was that wouldn't have happened if they hadn't taken that detour through music when they were young. So I guess in retrospect, it all works out.
Right, absolutely.
Well, and so, you mentioned something that was really interesting, right? Where you said, understandably, and this is something that hits home for me as well, right? That when you look like we do, depending on when you grew up, where you grew up, certain paths are going to be open to you and certain paths aren't. And I remember interviewing another fellow railroader, Marilee Taylor, back in the fall when we were kind of in the midst of the contract fight, potentially approaching a national rail shutdown. And Marilee told me about, what it was like to kind of be one of like, a woman conductor, or she was an engineer at a time when there weren't many, women engineers. And I guess I was going to ask that about you and your dad. Like, did it feel then like the railroads were a little more open to you?
Well, to answer a question about having a female employee, I received a book about the first Union Pacific engineer of color, and I was looking at the book, and I read, and it was a very good book, interesting. And I know the lady, I think she lives out, I think in Nebraska or someplace. Well, incidentally, I work with a colleague, and she actually is still with CSX. She actually went back home, and we actually worked together. And she was a woman of color. It was one of, on the division, I worked out of Florence division at one time. There were three, maybe four Black women conductors. We had one out of our terminal, which is Hamlet. Then there was two that were down in Abbeville. Actually, it was three, but one, of course, one doesn't work. And the other two, I'm not sure. One I know is working, another one is. And two were Black women. One was a white lady. And incidentally, you do have a few, but as far as just getting in and trying to know how many of your colleagues you have, I've looked at it, and of course, they're the local guys, but I try to look at it as just you're having people that are doing the work and able to do the work in a competent level. And of course, I knew, the things that my dad did, that job disappeared. And of course, automation and a few things, but then having to do the work of trying to fit in and figure out your niche. Yeah, you were kind of pigeonholed, so to speak. And that's why I tried to come in with it and looking at it, take the best opportunity, learn and work with what you've got and move up. Incidentally, just to take all you can and do the best of what you've got, with what you got, rather.
Yeah. And I mean, it makes sense because like you said, like this is something that railroad workers have been telling me nonstop, right? Is that like, it is a good job, right? I mean, it's like one of the best blue collar jobs you can find in terms of the pay, in terms of the pension. I mean, that's why, so many folks for so many years, if you were vested in the railroads after like 5 years, you're pretty much in for life. And like this, it's been so sad to hear workers tell me that like it doesn't feel that way anymore, and they're seeing people with 15, even 20 years like leave the industry altogether, or maybe they'll kind of run to passenger service as kind of like a refuge. And so I know that we're going to kind of start tracing that over the course of your career, like how you've seen the industry change and what it looks like now. But I guess before we get there, let's focus in on that time when you hired out. So when did you hire out on the railroads?
I decided after trying my hand at the public school or so, it was the end of the war, 2004, about December 2004. I've done part-time stints and I taught public school a year, by the way, and of course, dealing with not so competent administration toward the end of 2004. I decided for that following year, 2005, I said, let me just try something different and let me try to get some stability, because I was almost 30 then. I had my graduate degree, in addition to taking auditions, which I didn't get that playing job, and I didn't want to go on to pursue doctoral work, incidentally, because I do have a master's in tuba performance, incidentally, a master's in music and performance. I decided, let's just try something to see if it would get me compensation. So I've heard CSX was hiring, and with my being from Florence, I knew that there was going to be a long wait, because in this area, the region where I'm from is called the PD region. And yes, so if you see the PD swamp, that is actually accurate. PD region or PD swamp, the Great PD River. Florence was basically based off of that. And of course, the surrounding towns, Dillon, Marion, et cetera, the I-95 corridor, northeastern South Carolina, that is a big part of it. And I decided to give it a try. So what I had to do, instead of looking at Florence, I wound up hiring, and they were looking for conductors in Charlotte, North Carolina. So I was familiar with the town because I played with the orchestra. Yes, I had a good relationship with the Charlotte Symphony. So I decided, well, hey, go ahead and give Charlotte a try. It's a big town. And hey, if you can make some money and do it, why not? So I went to Richmond, Virginia in May. And I took the exam that was offered, and it was a program personality test. And it was a local hotel up there in Richmond, Virginia, one evening. I think it was a Monday or Tuesday evening, I believe. And anyhow, I took it, and it was proctored about 8 o'clock. Took it that evening, and I was okay. So when I got done, I decided, okay, we'll go back home. And I drove down to Fayetteville, incidentally, that night, got a little tired and stayed with a relative. So found out they accepted me. Then went to training in June. And from June to about July, I was in Jacksonville, Florida, University of North Florida. We trained there. And we learned the basics. They quizzed us and gave us testing. Then we went on the field training to Charlotte, North Carolina. Well, we went to Atlanta went to Atlanta at the READY Institute, which is acronym for Railroad Education Development Institute. And I had actually pretty decent instructors, and instructors at University of North Florida were good too. And from there, spent 2 weeks in Atlanta. And then the 1st of August, I went to on-the-job training in Charlotte at Panoka Yard. And from the end of August to September to mid-October, I trained, and then I became a promoted conductor. So that was my first start on the railroad in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Man, well, all right, take me back to that time. Like set the scene here. So you just got, you just gone down to Atlanta. You got your training. Now you're coming back up. You're stepping into the train yard. Like, I guess, like, what was it like for you in those first few weeks and months? Like, just getting accustomed to that job, because I even though we've talked to so many railroaders over the past year, like, I still feel like I'm constantly learning new things about what you guys do every day. So, like, I guess just for listeners who have never been on that side of the railroads, like, yeah, take us through that. Like, what did it look like? What did a typical week look like? What kind of goes into that job, and how were you as a young, as just starting out in the industry? Like, how were you adapting to all of that?
Well, when realizing, and of course, I'm acutely aware now the differences, seeing passenger service, i.e., which it may be intercity service, which is Amtrak, versus a commuter railroad, let's say Southeast Pennsylvania Transit Authority, SEPTA, in Pennsylvania, the Metro Transit Authority, or Metro in Chicago, New York's Transit, or the MBTA, Massachusetts Bay Area Transit Authority, or Los Angeles Metrolink, or the varying agencies. There's a difference in that. And then you have freight, which, of course, well, it was 8 carriers, and I've seen it dwindle even through my lifetime. I'm familiar with freight operations, and of course, I'm familiar with passenger operations. So Florence, of course, has its north-south trains, as well as the dedicated freight runs, i.e. intermodal. So you kind of see the people stepping up and riding. Now, to debunk the myth of, hey, that railroad gets over and ride all day, all night, that was quickly dismissed, because as I trained, I started learning the basics of showing up for work, and then learning about changing a knuckle, which is a part of a rail car, which I've done it a few times, but you don't look forward to it. But I also learned about switching. And that came later. But my time when I first went to Charlotte, it was not glamorous at all. And I learned that quickly. So yeah, it changed my perspective in terms of going to work and getting up on the engine and going 100 miles, waving, sticking my hand out the window, waving at kids. No. That was nothing. It was nothing of the sort. No, when I got to Charlotte after my training periods in Atlanta and Jacksonville, oh man, you worked in the freight yard and you basically flat switched, which is the term of moving cars around, a crew, and we were switchman, foreman, and we were 3-man crew lead, switchman, foreman, and it was engineer. And you basically worked in the yard, and you may have serviced the customer, industrial customers, which dwindled, even as my career started back in July 2005 to where we are now. But no, it was on the ground, and we worked outside, whether it was hot. Oh gosh, and that was a little bit later, but I can never forget the summer of 2007 when it was really hot, and they cut the crews back to one person on the ground, i.e. the foreman. I was a yard job, so I was the foreman, and I had an engineer on the cab, in the locomotive, and we were servicing industry in 107-degree heat. Yes. So that became a little bit of I'm in this and it's okay, but yard job money, it was not glamorous. And no, it wasn't this big, large allotment of money that you were used to seeing. You work with that kids, and I also worked a good bit of nights. Oh, now, because you're working daytime? No. You're going to work a lot of, graveyard shifts, so to speak, or nighttime, because a lot of the railroad happens at night, as well as bad weather, inclement weather. So you kind of get used to it. I was fortunate, and I really do appreciate the fact that I did work with men that knew how to switch. And there's an art that you have to keep yourself safe, but they give you the list and tell you what cars they want, what track, and they tell you the order, and you have to know how to comprehend that, keep yourself safe, follow the rules, but also you have to have a sense of, knowing what to do and be responsible. And at the time, there was another person working with you, because I trained with two other people on the ground in addition to the engineer, but then that was cut down to one person. And there were good people, but again, as anything goes with time, of course, automation and cutbacks and greed, it changed the dynamic eventually.
Man, again, just like it never gets easier hearing people like you tell me about that. And I want to talk about those cuts in 1 second, but just since you've had this experience, right? Like, so, my day job, I'm the editor-in-chief of the Real News Network here in Baltimore, right? So I do this podcast independently, but, mainly I focus on the reporting that we do there. And we just published a really great essay by a carman, a guy who's worked nearly 20 years as a carman. And
oh, yes.
Yeah. And he was kind of writing about East Palestine from the perspective of a carman, and was describing how, especially over the past 4 to 5 years, things have changed on his side of the tracks, and what that means in terms of I guess for everyone listening, the carmen these are the guys inspecting the rail cars, right? And so, they're crawling all over these things. They're checking out the bearings. They're looking at the axles. They're looking at up and down, top, bottom, side to side, right? And so with these cuts, every year you have fewer guys who are tasked with checking more cars in less time, right? And so and then you have this kind of philosophy from management that it's like, if you bad order a car and send it to the repair shop, you're costing the company money. And so obviously the incentive for you is going to be, well, I don't want to get, chewed out for sending cars to get repaired. So I'm going to, and also I'm under the gun and, just have an impossible workload. So naturally anyone is going to kind of fall into the kind of process of things where you're actually not able to take as much time as you want to check those cars. Things are going to kind of fall through the cracks, and that's sadly what we are seeing more frequently. And so again, I want to get to the cuts, what that looked like on your side, and what that translates to on the day-to-day side of the railroads, but just since you were there on the ground, I was wondering if you could just give listeners and myself like more of a sense of like that ecosystem, right? Because I think like all last year when we were reporting on the contract fights and we were going through, you know, the presidential emergency board, you know, the kind of national federal mediator, we were talking about a potential rail shutdown in September and then another one in December. A lot of the focus, understandably, tended to go towards like the conductors and the engineers, right? Because those are the people that most of us kind of think about when we think about the railroads. But what I hope we contributed to was getting people to understand that like there are a lot of people doing a lot of essential jobs to make the railroads happen. You know, you got like just, and that's why you have all these different unions representing different workers on the railroads. And so I was wondering if you could just sort of like give the newbies or the you know, people who don't see that side of the railroads like a little more of a sense of like what it looks like there in the yard. Like who are the different folks out there who aren't the conductors and engineers kind of working in the terminal?
And well, that I'm going to spread that over two main places where I work, because I started my career in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I wound up working over to Hamlet, North Carolina. All right. So with the same company, CSX, when I hired out in Charlotte, you had, I think it was 8 or 9 car inspectors, and they were good guys to work with. And basically, we interact with the car inspectors. They did the brake test. And again, they checked the brakes on the cars. And we, the conductors, the brown crew, so to speak, the switchman foreman, we knew they locked out the track and locked out the locomotive, and they did the testing of the cars. Again, that was the ecosystem. And we had a repair shop. And we, you know, respected each other's craft, so to speak. And we knew that the numbers with some of the guys they hired out pre-1985, and that was a definite year for the contracts because, again, they were protected workers versus someone after 1985. And yeah, that's another thing within itself. But we knew the older school guys, and they knew their jobs, and they could tell you stories. And again, we appreciated that mentorship. And again, Panoka Yard was small, but Charlotte, being the city that it is growing, the intermodal business picked up. So again, we knew that there were grumblings about wanting to do away with the size of the crew. So they did cut the number of people working on the ground from a switchman foreman to a foreman. And the car inspectors, when somebody retired, you knew basically as that person retired, you might not fill in that vacancy. So that was Charlotte. And again, the Great Recession back 2008, 2009, it was bad and brutal. I mean, cutbacks, I lost my seniority. So I want to stay into the business. And again, I was not able to leave necessarily on my accord because, again, the recession. So I decided, well, go and try my hand over to the class yard, which was the Hump Terminal facility, the classification facility in Hamlet, which is about 75, rail miles, 85 miles from Charlotte. And that facility, car inspectors, you have 2 yards. Oh, yes, it was a big facility built under the Seaboard Airline in 1945. 1954, 1954. And I went there. That was where it came traveling and learning territory. And the guys, of course, taking trains and freight over many more miles. And of course, you're dealing with the signal railroad. And you saw the car inspectors. You also saw mechanical maintenance away, signal maintainers. And those guys, incidentally, you become friends with those guys because they're part of that infrastructure there. You've got signal maintainers. They work on crossings and additional signals and the defect detectors. That's the big thing too. Maintenance away, whether they're track inspectors who inspect the rails, particularly when it's hot, but also check the rails for maintenance. Um, Gosh, you also have people that work, if you're in a classification facility, that work on the retard. So all of that, and welders, car inspectors, and Hamlet handled sometimes 2,000 and 3,000 cars, actually received more, 10,000 up in a few shifts. And that had to be processed. So yeah, that was an eye-opening, being able to work there too. That's when I really got to travel, when I went to Hamlet in 2009. So yes, my career did, and I was out of work when the Great Recession hit. Basically about 4 or 5 months, and really I qualified in Hamlet. So yes, I then left Charlotte and went east and worked out of Hamlet, and that's when my career picked up. And a lot of my colleagues that I hired out in Charlotte actually came over to Hamlet.
Wow, man, I could talk to you for another hour about the recession and that whole time period, because in a lot of ways, that's where like this show and my trajectory kind of started. Because don't worry, listeners, I'm not going to make you guys listen to the story another time, but yeah, man, I mean, we lost everything in the recession. We lost the house that I grew up in. Like, this time, 12 years ago, I was a temp working in warehouses and factories back home in Southern California, and didn't know what was going to happen. And I could just see and feel in myself, right? Like how depressed I was, how depressed my dad and my mom were, and kind of how we were all holding that inside and blaming ourselves for a worldwide recession that was impacting millions and millions of people and families. Right. So the first person that I ever interviewed for this show was my dad, Jesus Alvarez, because I wanted to try to get him to talk about that stuff. And then we ended up talking for like almost 3 hours about his life, about, becoming a citizen, meeting my mom, building a family, and then just so much blowing up and disappearing in the recession and all that stuff. And I'm constantly reminded every time, we do another episode of just how important it is for us to provide space for each other to kind of talk about this stuff and to share our stories and to remind ourselves that our stories are important and deserve to be shared, right? And folks like you, I mean, you have so much knowledge and experience and so many incredible stories. It's like, why don't we talk about that more? It drives me nuts. But that's kind of, I guess I just wanted to point that out, because it's like both of our paths kind of intertwine at that historical moment. So talk to me then, about what happened afterwards. Like you said, you were kind of out of work for maybe 4 months, and then things kind of picked up. So what happened then?
Well, when I was cut off out of Charlotte, it basically, and you could see it happening, because we knew we saw where the company overhired, and yet the freight that was coming into the yard wasn't much. And then you just hearing about the news, because I'm the type, of course, I listen to a lot of broadcast news. Not going to say I'm a news junkie, but I am aware of, National Public Radio and the big 3 or so media outlets, et cetera, et cetera. And we knew that things were a bit different from the customers and the cars coming in. So about 2008, just noticed a little cuts. And you don't think about it, but when it does happen, I'm going to say when Lehman Brothers, and that was the biggie. But that happened about 2008, 2009 or so. Well, 2008. That really was the eye-opener, because from there, each week, you notice somebody was cut off or somebody was back. And we have agreements, flowing back to being a conductor, because to get to become a locomotive engineer, now you have to start out as a conductor, and then you then get promoted or get called to engine service training school. And if you were an engineer and there's no slot, then if they don't use you as a locomotive engineer, then you go back to being a conductor. And the engineers that had time that were above me, because I came in, I had 2 or 3 years, about 2008 or 2008. Well, they who had already about 8, 9, or 10 years, a lot of those men who were actually, and yes, they were male, that were operating locomotives, they became conductors again. So that basically pushes me or someone of lower seniority out. We had guys that were training and they actually were forced out, and some of them were able to survive. A lot of us went to the classification yard when it was, get in where you fit in. So I got cut off, and myself, my last days were December 2008. And I knew a good friend of mine who I actually spoke to yesterday. He was cut off right before Christmas, December 15th or so. Yeah, was cut off at his job. I was able to hold on because my seniority, he's the man below me. I held on right until January 9th. And I'll never forget my last day working when my seniority ran out. I worked the job 322 in the yard. Oh man, it was cold that night. It was, I think the low temperature was 9. And I've had to get out and work. And the guy who should have worked the job, he called out. So I went in and I was like, man, I'm going to end my career working a cold job. And of course, hey, go in and you do it. And I went in that, and it was, it was a Monday or Tuesday. It was one of those days in the week. And I went in and I got my call because you used to call you on the phone. And after I was done, I came in and it told me I was displaced. And that was it. So here I am in my apartment. I decided, oh gosh, what I'm going to do. And I pay month rent, which is expensive. So I said, well, put my stuff in the storage. And I went back home to Florence. My folks didn't know. And that was another thing in itself. But I said, well, let me try Hamlet, North Carolina, which was the classification facility. And they went through their share of cutbacks too, of course, because then those following months, so 2009, I was able to actually not work there in the yard, but there was an outline point switcher job, which was under the jurisdiction of Hamlet, which I, followed or trained on. And nobody really wanted that job because it was closer to my house versus North Carolina. And again, I live in South Carolina, but yet to go to work, I drove from where I'm at currently, drive about an hour and a half, close to 75 miles just to go to work. So no, you knew what was going on, but then you said, well, I wanted to keep the job. I want to keep the benefits. Drawing the railroad unemployment's not glamorous. But no, I went in and I did that, and it was a job, but I realized I still stayed in with it. And the following year, because I was able to stick around enough and I worked out of Hamlet enough, I made a pact with my folks to go back and forth, and I did. Because I had to qualify on like 2,200 miles of territory. Oh yes, I had to get on a freight train or what have you and go to outlying points, Abbeville, Greenwood, South Carolina, Bostic, North Carolina. Oh gosh, up the Rocky Mountain, North Carolina. Eventually extended an interprovincial run to Charleston, but Florence, going through Florence down to Charleston. You're going to those places, Andrews, South Carolina, Wilmington, North Carolina. Well, yes, you will work those places as outline point jobs. So no, it was a lot there to do, and you grew up. But then one thing I can say, and to put a good spin on it, is when I learned how to flat switch, it was much, much easier for me to be able to take those skills and to work around equipment, because I felt then on the line of road, hey, I knew how to do this. And that was a big part of me fitting in, going to Hamlet. So yeah, it was a lot easier.
Well, and what this also kind of makes me think, right, is that we've heard a lot about kind of the introduction of precision, quote unquote, I'm using air quotes here, people can't see me, the quote unquote precision scheduled railroading. And I know that this concept has been around for a while, like since like the 90s, I think, but it really kind of took off in earnest in recent years, right? Across like the different major rail carriers. But it sounds like, even just like from what you've been describing, like, that those changes, right, that really got supercharged by the introduction of precision scheduled railroading, which, I mean, we don't have to get all into that. But I guess, again, just for listeners to refresh your memory, right? I mean, what folks have told us is that like this is just kind of the industry generated term for the entire kind of Wall Street led philosophy of cutting the operating ratio every year, no matter what, right? So cutting labor costs like cutting investment in track maintenance and preventative inspection and all, like, you know, making sure that every department is fully staffed, so on and so forth. So like instead of doing that, just chopping costs, quote unquote, left and right, reducing the crew sizes on the train, reducing the crew sizes in the yard, reducing the maintenance of way crews, and so on and so forth. And every year just getting that operating ratio down so that you're spending less while, you know, like you're making the cars longer. You know, as we already know, a lot of freight gets moved in the country, and that's the only way it can be moved. Like you can't just unload all of that onto the highways. So there are a lot of shippers, a lot of customers who have no choice but to use the railroads, and the railroads know that. So they kind of have a captive market. And so what they learned was they could just charge what they want. You know, they could have a chokehold on the supply chain. They could keep cutting, you know, their staff and piling more work onto fewer workers. All the while, like the industry is more profitable than it's ever been. We're talking billions and billions and billions of dollars here in profits, stock buybacks, shareholder dividends, executive salaries, all that crap. And so the reason I kind of go into that, Bryan, is just because it sounds like, you know, what you're describing is like you could see these changes like taking hold like long before, you know, the precision schedule railroading like really became like the name of the game in the industry. Am I reading that right?
Yes, you are. And all right, I could go back to my days in Charlotte for a sec. About 2007. Well, there was and it was actually defeated. It was the Children's Fund, I believe. The Children's Fund was a hedge fund that was wanting to take over CSX's operation. And basically, they were going to start the strip back, so to speak, of operations because, again, the company didn't make a lot of investments previously in the 90s into their infrastructure. Whether it be locomotives or track, et cetera. And I have to say, after the big Conrail merger, Michael Ward and the management group at the time did invest back into the locomotives. They invested back into fixing the track. And it was successful. It really was. However, you could see that you heard about the cutbacks on other places. And yes, we knew who Ewing Hunter Harrison was, but we didn't think that it was going to just change or take hold. We just knew that, hey, the trajectory was going to be big and bright. You know, again, Michael Ward was the CSX CEO before Ewing Harrison. Yes, we were expecting good things. And yes, we knew that there were tips back as far back as 2008. The Children's Fund did do that, but that was thwarted off because people voted against that. But you fast forward to the 2016, 2017, and again, in comes, you know, the elections and Ewing Harrison and all of that. And I think he was able to get influence because, again, he lived in Florida. And of course, I think he was a member of Maranago's club.
That inner sanctuary, that sanctum, right, with all those people.
Yeah, so he had the captive ear, so to speak, of future presidential candidates. So,
well, and so what did that look like for you on the job? Like as this stuff really started to take hold?
Oh, it was bad. We started seeing that, oh gosh, they've made this change, but then we realized, well, wait a sec. If you don't have the X number of people there running and you're going to make the yard a flat switching yard, it takes time to do that, and you didn't have enough people to do the work. How are you going to make this? It's almost like you're pulling cars out of the air, but yet you don't have the people to manufacture them or to make just anything, or so to speak. I've heard the term pulling hen's teeth. It's almost seemed too good to be true, and yet we noticed the cutbacks. Then we noticed the people that were laid off. Then we noticed the discipline, and I have to say, the whole crush with management. Oh gosh, and I have to say this: the sociopaths, and I use that term just of all of the people that they've had in. It's been just terribly mismanaged, and nobody knew what was the focus. Nobody knew what's the focus. Customers were mad. Oh gosh, I worked a local switcher, and the customers were just irate at all the changes, and just people quit. Oh, it was terrible. So one of the biggest fiascos the country, or even myself, or the industry could ever experience. Just terrible.
Man, I'm so sorry to hear that. I mean, I really, really am. And I mean, I can only imagine, given all of that, what it was like for you and your fellow railroaders to sort of watch, I guess, the media and the response from the media and the politicians and even the public for a lot of like last year when, as we've already mentioned, right, the kind of high stakes contract negotiations between the 12 different unions representing over 15,000 rail workers and the freight carriers, the class ones, like all of that came to a head, even though at that point we were like 3 years into the contract negotiation. So it's not like this had just come from nowhere. It's just a lot of us on the outside just didn't know about it or just weren't paying attention. And I mean, I hope that more people, and I know that more people are paying attention now, which is a positive, but I wanted to just ask, like, what was it like for you, I guess, like kind of as a railroader, like watching kind of your contract fight either be ignored or then when it was finally kind of covered last year, like the kind of coverage it was getting? Like, what do you think maybe folks in the public weren't seeing and weren't hearing about when the rest of the kind of national media started paying attention to the crisis on the railroads?
I think a lot of people didn't realize that with the unions and the job of the railroad, it's a structured way of how you are supposed to deal with contracts, but also the fact that worker input or employee input was never great. And the leverage was always going to be for the carrier, so to speak. A lot of people didn't understand that the days off we didn't have. I worked my career primarily off the extra board. And again, when they cut the extra board back to the point that I didn't stand to work in Hamlet, I had to look to outline point job, which incidentally was controlled by another set of so-called management, so-called professionals, and I use that term very strongly there, so-called, but no, the customers weren't getting the service, and it was just the public didn't understand. When outcry started coming about the service of the train, we knew that they were trying to do more with less, but we also knew the trains weren't getting across because you didn't have the crews, the personnel. The people, general public, didn't know about how we work or didn't work. The extra board is on call. The public doesn't know about that. And also, when I think the general public will understand, the railroad have their own governing bodies and own structures. And to strike, no, that's illegal. They didn't understand that. And no, a lot of what should have happened didn't. And this whole thing with the contract negotiation, we wondered, and it showed who was on our work on the side of the rank and file, so to speak, which, hey, wasn't big. This is even some of the politicians that we thought were on our side. So no, it feels not good.
Well, and I mean, I think it bears repeating, right? That after what happened, right? Let us not forget, we quote unquote averted a potential rail shutdown in September because we were approaching the end of the cooling off period. after the Presidential Emergency Board had released its report in August, which meant that after the end of that period, then legally strikes could occur or lockouts initiated by the carriers could occur. And then, there was this kind of closed door 11th hour bargaining session involving Secretary of Labor Marty Walsh, Pete Buttigieg, and everyone, in the kind of contract negotiating war room. And so we got this kind of like tentative agreement that was kicked back to the membership. There were different kind of timelines for different unions to vote on that, yada, yada, yada. So anyway, like I'm paving over a lot here, but again, folks have heard us kind of cover this over the past year and a half. I just want to kind of make sure that everyone's remembering the timeline. So then we were walking our way up to, the end of November. It was looking like, there were still, a lot of members in the unions who were understandably dissatisfied with the contents of that tentative agreement, were prepared to vote it down or had already voted it down. It was looking like a potential strike could occur in early December. And, Joe Biden urged Congress to force that contract down workers' throats. Everyone in D.C. congratulated themselves on saving Christmas and averting a national rail shutdown, while essentially giving these rail carriers who have destroyed the supply chain and the workers who make it run everything they fucking wanted, pardon my French. And so, like, I was staring at this and I was like, well, what incentive do the carriers have to change? Like, none, because if they know that this is what anyone, whoever's in the White House, whoever's in Congress, like they did last year, like they did back in the early 90s, they're going to be that ace in the hole for the carriers, and they're going to force workers to kind of accept a contract that they don't want to. And so I wanted to ask, like, from your vantage point, like, what has it been like for you and your coworkers after that whole debacle? Like, because I think if we hadn't had the catastrophe of the Norfolk Southern derailment in East Palestine, like, I mean, like, this wouldn't be on anyone's radar. It's just like, because such a horrific event happened and now the public's attention is on this stuff again, and they're realizing that in fact these derailments happen quite frequently and there are reasons for that and that we should be looking at and actually addressing. But if we hadn't had that, I don't know if anyone would still be kind of invested in this as much as they should be. So I just wanted to ask, for you personally and for, railroad workers in general that you've known and been talking to, like, what has it been like since that whole shit show at the end of November and early December last year?
Well, I know for a fact there's a lot of displeasure with the agreement. I can tell you that my colleagues looked at that contract and said, "God, no days off." They were displeased when the first round of talks, so to speak, with the bargaining board, they were upset with that because what it was, they felt that, hey, they ignored, again, time off, the pay rate, well, the amount bargained for, well, it shouldn't even be bargained. It's just, should be the pay raise was low. They wanted like 20 or 45%, something like that. You didn't get that. And again, we're going through this record inflation and we still work through the pandemic. We still didn't have changes to the times off, vacation, et cetera. And yet you're still cutting people and you needed a bunch of people. But then you didn't focus in on training. The training, and that's another thing. It's just the people that they tried to hire, oh gosh, they didn't a bit more know what was going on than the man in the room, because not only they're not trained, but they're not doing the protocols of working, thinking about what you're doing, paying attention. You mentioned derailments. Well, if you were, let's say, switching your car out, just use it as an example, you would know that if you got to go into a track, and if you're putting cars into a track, and it's, let's say, off a control track, there's going to be a switch that you have to line. Then you also going to have something called a derail. And that's a device, or whether it's a device or a cutout person on the track that's going to keep a train on the track or derail it off just in case. It's kind of like an insurance thing, the make sure you're not going to cause much damage. But the guys or the new hires didn't know how to do that. Also, they did not have a clear sense of keeping themselves safe in terms of equipment or switching out equipment. You're moving around cars and things. And what I say to that is if you're not keeping the knowledge of the old guys who got 25, 26 years in or more, and that they leave, well, who's going to pass on the knowledge to the people that you want to hire? I think before this precision schedule railroad, now return the mic back to you, is we had guys that could have passed that knowledge on. But instead, when they cut back the first round, those guys were gone. You won't get those guys back. And of course, that is a travesty in itself. And no, we're not pleased. A lot of my friends and colleagues are just saying, hey, when we went retirement, that's it. They wouldn't recommend to anyone. And we don't want to see people are fatality. That's what we want to avoid. We don't want to see that. We want you to go home the same way you came to work, in one piece, and with your job, of course. You didn't tear nothing up. You didn't hurt anybody. That's what we want to do when we're working. And no, we think that was all thrown out for naught, whether it was the politicians who don't understand anything or the general public who was just held out there, or the carriers who are only looking at their stock buyback to some rich person who doesn't do any work. That is the biggest thing I think we've gotten out of. We figure, well, who's our friends? Who pulls for us? Nationalization, I think, is one thing that might welcome, but yeah, who's pulling for the rail employees? That's what we're wondering.
Well, geez, I think that you said it all there, man. And I really, really hope that folks who are listening to this, right, kind of understand that, as I said earlier, like, we have a role to play here. Like, we have to keep our attention focused on this. We have to keep demanding accountability for, what these companies and their, greedy shareholders and executives have done to this vital workforce, what they've done to our supply chain, and what they've done to put, our communities and communities like East Palestine at hazard because of, their relentless greed and their relentless kind of need to boost their operating ratio, so on and so forth. But, I also wanted to, before we let you go, man, I wanted to ask about kind of what's been going on with your work and career specifically of late, because I know that you are kind of dealing with some real bullshit, pardon my French, and I wanted to ask if you could tell us a bit more about that, and especially like what folks listening to this can do to show solidarity with you and to support you.
Okay, well, my thing is, if you don't know, I was basically purportedly by arbitration dismissed because I violated safety rules. And I'll tell you, a lot of the railroad class 1 carriers, if you looked at their managers, they are some of the worst people, and you would wonder how did they get their job. Sociopaths that you could find. If the top level executives that I'm talking about with their background, their so-called education or lack of education, who they are, if you would talk to them, seeing who they are basically towing the line of the people that have the railroads in also that want to do the precision PSR. But also you're dealing with people and all of the isms. Nepotism is bad. Bigotry is bad. Racism is bad. I could truthfully say for myself, with the credentials I had, and I knew the management corps that I dealt with on the division, they were all white, male, and they were ignorant. And they felt that I, myself, was a threat because I came in, some of the stuff that I did, going above and beyond, even get the equipment to work. And, even I've dealt with a few bad managers that were actually female too, that basically you hired people not because of what they knew, but because they were your buddy. And if you're seeing that in the field, imagine what headquarters has. So no, I've been out of work and I fought it with the union. I hadn't worked since May 2021. So yes, I was dismissed, of course, trying to fight that, and then arbitration says otherwise. And it was an era of harassment for the Black employees. Oh yes, certain ones were protected years ago with certain suits and settlements that they couldn't talk about. And remember this, the non-disclosure agreement or NDA, that is common, very, very common, particularly with CSX. Start asking, well, how do you hire? What are your credentials for getting someone into the railroad? Then you're going to ask yourself to the general public, well, how does this person respond well to somebody? You know, when you hear the spokesperson, you're not actually talking to that manager who makes the decision. You're not talking to chief of operations. You know, they're held up someplace. They're not answering to you, the public, who are doing the real, who the beneficiaries of the service. And what I can say is we think diversity is good, but when it looks down the industry like the railroad, there's a lot of peeling back of the layers of the onion, so to speak. When you see that, that's what needs to happen. I think myself, and I know some of my colleagues are working, and again, I knew I was singled out because, again, you know, when you're dealing with people and their particular perceptions, you know, racism, bigotry, et cetera, you're dealing with people that are threatened by someone that not only knows what they're doing, but also someone that's going to go against the management or someone that's going to just call it out, hey, this isn't right. And I really do think that a lot of what happened that could make it better for not just myself, for someone, is the public need to know, say, hey, we need to call this out. You know, I wish people could get the human resources of the railroads to see, well, wait a sec, you might have one or two people of color in on this other job, but who's actually doing the work? What's been your hiring? What have you done? I think that's really one of the worst things. And you can see it, oh yeah, CSX, Norfolk Southern, but yeah, I mean, Fortress, Jacksonville, so to speak. Oh yeah, there's a lot of things that they will not tell you there. And I think myself, hey, if anyone's listening, I will tell you this. When they do listen, hey, I don't think I'm going to do is do my job, get my job, go back and go and forth and do and work to serve the greater good. That's all it should be. Not because you're figuring that I did something wrong. You've got some pent up phobia or fear because of someone that looks like me or something that you took from years ago. No, we all, my friends and I, became into work. And yes, it was bad harassment. It was bad harassment. I mean, my colleagues, that are of color can tell you some stories. But again, it gets swept under the rug and you see it, and yet no one does. I mean, you're talking to a person that has a master's plus 18 hours, and yet I was never promoted as a dispatcher. Yet I was never told, hey, go into transportation. No, and it wasn't because I worked badly, but it's because I dealt with sociopathic management that kept in the supremacist attitude that if I'm hiring my friend or my buddy, we're going to keep everything in check, and everything in check here is what's led to what we have now.
Man, and you know, it's such a powerful kind of statement that I would normally like end the episode there on that final word that you said, because I want people to really sit and think with that. But I couldn't help but hop back in because I'm thinking about the story that you shared at the beginning, right? With your dad working on the railroads and like during derailments, being there with like cooking for everyone and cooking for the people doing the cleanup, the crew, and like, you know, and even then, like you said, like still, you know, they're dealing with, you know, a lot of kind of racist problems in and beyond the railroad industry. And it's just like when I think of that scene that you described with your dad and your grandma, right? And that the way that we handled derailments then and how, you know, how often derailments happen then compared to now. And I'm just really struck by that. And I guess I just wanted to sort of ask, like, by way of kind of rounding out, like what do you think has changed for the better in that time? And what do you think hasn't changed at all?
Well, I think overall for the industry, I think you've got people that care, that know what they're doing. They actually care about their job. They come to work, they take it seriously, they go above and beyond. I mean, I just saw it even myself working my years. Gosh, me and my colleagues that I work with, we showed up, my attendance, I have one of the best attendance records. And I'm not ashamed to tell anyone that. I have one of the best attendance records. I didn't take off other than when I needed to. I've always showed up, didn't use time, didn't mark off or anything, so to speak, unless it was a bad weather condition or something. But no, I showed up, operation, went above and beyond, bought the equipment in, and I think the training was better, but then now even that has been laid way to the side. But also, I think we've got to ask ourselves, hey, the next generation is not going to do some of the things there. Let's look back and say, do it better. But also, hey, we're not in it for greed, but rather the greater good. If you want to get good treatment, hey, treat people like the way you want to be treated. Look at the employees, not as workers, but as colleagues, and maybe like even your own children. You're showing benevolence to them. That's how I would see. That's how I see. I think that's what should be improved upon and focused upon. The thing I could tell you is just if you talk to some of the people that, whether they're conductors or mechanical personnel, signals, etc., hey, you hear their stories. They're the people that want to work. Then whether it's an isolated locale, they want to do the right thing, and they know that the job is a good job. But hey, allow them to do the work to keep the public safe. And not only that, allow them to do what's necessary to keep the trains rolling. I mean, something may happen, but the people deserve better, the public. But not only that, if you got your infrastructure there, hey, let's do it for the good of everybody. I'm thinking more win-win, but yeah, we've got to, hey, do better. If you know better, you can do better, right?
Thank you so much for watching The Real News Network, where we lift up the voices, stories, and struggles that you care about most. And we need your help to keep doing this work. So please, tap your screen now, subscribe, and donate to The Real News Network. Solidarity forever.